I grew up here in Los Angeles until Pearl Harbor. And then, as I think you know, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were summarily rounded up.
There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base.
I came from San Francisco. I entered Heart Mountain at the age of 9, and I was here for 3 years. I left at the age of 12.
Of boards.
What does that message say to you?
What does the message say to me? Well, I'm not surprised because when we went back to California, my father in his used car from Minneapolis and my uncle, we caravan together.
We got on a train and then rode the train for 4 days, 3 nights. Each of us were carrying our one suitcase. Unfortunately, they never told us we were coming to Wyoming, and so it was difficult packing. We didn't know what clothes to bring.
The signing of Executive Order 9066 was a tragic event, and it caused many lives to go through terrible days of torment from the whites. However, in 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt triumphantly rescinded the order.
The U.S. was not involved in World War II that started on September 1, 1939 until December 7, 1941 due to the Japanese Navy Air Service bombing the U.S. military base in Pearl Harbor. This attack killed 2,403 people in total, including 2,335 military personnel and 68 civilians.
After the Pearl Harbor bombing, a draft for all young men was instituted throughout the United States asking them to serve in the military. Approximately 100,000 U.S. men served in the military, and over 50 military installations were made.
Before World War II started, due to the Holocaust, many immigrants began to move to the United States in search of a better life, and this continued for a long time. According to a 1940 census, Washington State had approximately 14,000 people of Japanese descent.
There is a push to expel all Japanese American ancestors started by white farmers in California. It was clear to Japanese Americans that their life was changing in many ways, and for the worse. The Japanese began to be taken from their homes and put into internment camps all over the Pacific Northwest.
Just by March 1942, approximately 300 people of Japanese ancestry were moved into these camps. In these camps, the Japanese would be held for 3 to 4 years, depending on which camp they were held at. In these camps, the Japanese would play baseball and do normal things, just in a very abnormal environment.
The Japanese began establishing schools, houses of worship, and economic and cultural institutions, and essentially, they made their own home in the U.S. In some of the internment camps, the Japanese went by number instead of name, and it says so in this interview with someone who was in a Japanese internment camp.
I was 13 years old when I came here. Our family number was 8648. So every family had a number. We didn't go by name, we went by number. And in our family, we had my brother, his wife, and his kid.
On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Order 9066, authorizing exclusion outside of the Pacific Military Zone. The Pacific Military Zone was essentially an imaginary boundary line that started at the Cascade Mountains and it continued down the spine of California, north to south. Furthermore, this order meant the Japanese Americans could be excluded from the rest of the United States.
In fact, 2/3 of the Japanese Americans put into internment camps were U.S. citizens. Then later, on March 22, 1942, Congress implemented this order by passing Public Law 503. After this, the United States military gave the Japanese Americans time to voluntarily evacuate the area before they started moving them into internment camps. The camps were fenced in, guarded, and isolated.
There were 10 internment camps in total, one of which was named Camp Harmony. Camp Harmony was also known as one of the largest assembly centers during 1942, and at one point Camp Harmony contained 7,390 people of Japanese descent. It was a very difficult environment to live in. Quote, "The room which I was confined in was a makeshift barracks from a horse stable," end quote. Sanitation was also another huge problem for these camps, but especially the camp located in Puyallup. Another evacuee said, quote, The ground was a vast ocean of mud, and explained how whenever it would rain, the ground softened into slippery ooze.
The Japanese who were put into these camps lost personal liberties, and most lost their homes and property. Many of the Japanese Americans challenged the government's actions in court cases, but the Supreme Court still upheld their legality.
During the internment, there were anti-Japanese organizations. The most powerful organizations back then were the Remember Pearl Harbor League. The anti-Japanese organization was created during the World War.
The Remember Pearl Harbor League protested the movement of the Japanese resettling on the West Coast. They were shut down, and so the Japanese settled there. Quote, "The Japanese were a menace until removed and will become a menace again when returned. The Japs must not come back." End quote. That is what the Remember Pearl Harbor League said about the Japanese.
The group accused the Japanese children of disloyalty because they were taught Japanese culture before American culture. This group spread racist myths and booklets that they handed out to people. Their pamphlet even advocated amending the Constitution to deprive Japanese from being able to be a citizen. Quote, "On the sole ground of disloyalty, all Japanese should be removed from the United States and its territories." End quote. In 1944, only a couple years after the camp started, President Roosevelt rescinded Executive Order 9066 due to the reason from the Supreme Court that loyal citizens cannot be lawfully detained. After this, the camps were closed and most of the internees were released.
Later, on October 30th, 1946, the very last of the Japanese Americans were released from a detention center they were put in after the camps, and none of the Japanese Americans were ever once found guilty of sabotage or espionage. Then on July 2nd, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed the Evacuation Claims Act, which allowed detainees to sue the United States government for damages and property loss. The government paid about $35 million in damages. In 1952, the survivors of the internment camp successfully influenced the United States Congress to allow people from Japan to then become naturalized citizens of the U.S.
On February 19, 1976, President Ford formally canceled Executive Order 9066, and on August 10, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation apologizing to the internees and provided $20,000 to each survivor. In total, the United States government paid about $1.6 billion to the camp survivors.
Though there were anti-Japanese organizations, there were also just as many individuals that were in pro-Japanese organizations that were fighting for the rights of the Japanese. The Seattle Council of Churches was a very important organization with the return of the Japanese. First of what the Council of Churches did was they helped the Japanese reestablish themselves back in the West Coast.
The Seattle Council of Churches educated the city on Christian virtues of hospitality and acceptance, hoping by building the city on Christian virtues, the rest of America would be able to welcome them back a little bit easier. The council created many services to help the Japanese Americans return to the U.S. The council set up a program to provide jobs, housing, and social services, including counseling, medical care, social and recreational events, legal services, and serving as a liaison between the Japanese and government welfare agencies.
The council continued helping by sending out enlistment cards for a program the council created in the community. Through the cards, people could sign up to sponsor and give the Japanese Americans temporary or permanent housing. With the council getting more involved, the anti-Japanese organizations found it harder to survive.
After the internment camps were taken down, many of the Japanese Americans returned to their property and found that their property had been looted off for valuables and belongings. The local and state law enforcement showed indifference to the vandalism, theft, and even arson on the properties. The responsibility for the safeguarding of property bounced among many federal agencies and had been slowed down to set up the protection in the first place.
Some of the evacuees from the Puget Sound region settled elsewhere in Washington due to help from the federal government. A lot of families had to rely on the public to help them until they could harvest crops and get jobs. The Japanese Americans also wanted their firearms and cameras back that they were forced to give to the government upon order by Governor Langley in 1942.
Many people still do not welcome the resettlement of the Japanese and still do not want them living on their land, and remember the Auburn-based booklet from 1945 that argued the American-born Japanese cannot be loyal to both the United States and their heritage.